On the 22nd night, the men who had laughed at the warning were already dead. He didn't know that yet. What he knew was the sound of his own breathing, too loud in the dark, and the taste of dust that never left his mouth anymore. 3 weeks earlier, there had been 7 of them. Now there was one, alone on a ledge 200 feet above a river that never stopped moving, holding a canteen, he had been told, by a man he barely trusted, never to fill from the spring below. He hadn't filled it. That single refusal was the only reason he was still breathing. Somewhere below him, in a side canyon, the guide had circled on a hand-drawn map and told them never to enter. The desert was about to prove exactly what it had been trying to tell them since the first morning. By the end of this account, you will understand something that took search parties, geologists, and the Hopi people themselves decades to piece together, that a wilderness can carry instructions if you know how to read them, and that the difference between the men who walked out of the Grand Canyon in 1903 and the men who never came back wasn't luck, training, or equipment. It was whether they were willing to take advice from someone they had already decided was beneath them. What happened to that expedition and to the one man who survived 40 days after it fell apart is one of the strangest and least examined stories connected to the canyon's early exploration era. It isn't in the guidebooks. It barely made it into the newspapers of its own time, and almost all of it starts with 3 warnings given plainly in plain language by a man nobody in that party had any interest in believing. By 1903, the Grand Canyon was no longer a total blank on the map. John Wesley Powell had run the river decades earlier. Prospectors and surveyors had been cutting trails into the rim country for 20 years, chasing copper, asbestos, and government contracts. But the inner canyon, the maze of side drainages below the rim, was still mostly unmapped. And mining outfits kept sending small parties down anyway, betting that whoever found the next mineral seam first would keep it. One of those parties left the South Rim in early June of that year. 7 men. A mining engineer financing the trip, 4 laborers, a packer, and a guide hired at the last minute because nobody else in the region knew the side canyons well enough to take mules through them. The guide was Hopi. His name appears in the surviving account only as Tuvi, and almost nothing about him was written down beyond what the one survivor remembered years later. That absence of paperwork matters, and we'll come back to it. What matters first is what Tuvi told them on the second morning, before they had gone more than a few miles past the rim. He gave them 3 rules, not suggestions, not folklore dressed up as caution. Rules. Don't camp in the narrow wash below the second bend, even if it looks like the best flat ground for miles. Don't drink from the spring at the base of the limestone shelf, no matter how clear the water looks. And don't cross the open talus slope on the canyon's north-facing wall after midday, once the sun has been on the rock for a few hours. He didn't explain the second 2. He explained the first only a little. Water moves through that wash faster than a man can run, even under a sky that looks empty. Holt wrote all 3 warnings down in his field notebook that same evening, not because he believed them, but because a good record keeper writes everything down, useful or not. That notebook, recovered years later along with the rest of his effects, is one of the only pieces of physical documentation connecting this expedition to anything that actually happened. It lists the 3 rules almost word for word, as the survivor would later recall them in Holt's own handwriting, followed by a short line that reads more like a joke between men than a warning taken seriously. Guide insists we'll die if we ignore any of this. Noted. That single sentence, written in irritation on a Tuesday evening in June, is arguably the most important piece of evidence in the entire account because it proves the warning existed, specific and unambiguous, before any of what followed had happened. Nobody could later claim the danger was invented after the fact to explain a tragedy. It was on paper first. The engineer, a man named Holt, who had financed the whole expedition and considered himself the one actually in charge, wrote the warnings off as the kind of thing you'd expect from a guide trying to make himself seem indispensable. He said as much within earshot of the others. 2 of the laborers laughed. Tuvi didn't argue. He simply repeated the 3 rules once more, slower, and then said nothing else about it for 4 days. Those 4 days went exactly the way Holt expected. The mules held up. The trail Tuvi picked kept them out of the worst heat and off the loosest rock, and by the 4th evening, they had covered more ground than Holt's own maps predicted was possible. That success is what sealed the outcome. Because a party that starts believing its guide is overcautious and then watches that same guide deliver 4 flawless days doesn't conclude the guide was right. It concludes the terrain was never as dangerous as he made it sound. That's the trap. The warnings had already started to feel like superstition precisely because they were working. There was something else working against Tuvi in those first days, something that had nothing to do with the terrain at all. He was younger than every other man in the party except one of the laborers, and he was being paid less than the packer, whose job amounted to little more than keeping the mules fed. To Holt and the men who'd signed on with him, hierarchy on an expedition like this ran on money and title, not on who actually knew the ground. That assumption would cost them more than any of them understood on the second morning, and it kept costing them quietly for the next 2 weeks, long after the flood should have settled the question. On the fifth night, they reached the wash. It was, by every ordinary measure, the best campsite they had seen in a week. Flat sand, shade from the canyon walls until well past sunrise, and a breeze that kept the insects down. Tuvi looked at it for a long moment and said they should go another mile before dark and camp on the bench above instead. Holt asked why, and Tuvi gave him the only answer he had already given, that the wash below the second bend was not a place to sleep. Holt looked at a clear sky, at mule tracks worn smooth by what he assumed were other prospecting parties who'd clearly camped here before without incident, and made the call. They stayed. Nothing happened that night. Nothing happened the next morning either, and by the time they broke camp, 2 of the laborers were openly mocking the whole idea that a dry wash under a cloudless sky could kill anyone. What none of them understood, and what wouldn't be documented by hydrologists for another several decades, is that a storm 40 miles away, over ground none of them could see, can send a wall of water down a canyon drainage with almost no warning at the point of impact. The sky above the camp had been perfectly clear. The sky above the plateau feeding that wash had not. They were 3 hours' walk from that campsite, climbing out of the drainage entirely, when the flood came through behind them. They didn't see it happen. They heard it, a sound one of the laborers later described only as the canyon exhaling, and when they doubled back to check, the flat sand where they'd slept was gone, replaced by a churn of mud, uprooted brush, and boulders that hadn't been there the day before. If they had stayed one more night, the account makes no attempt to soften what would have happened. The mules had been tethered on the bench above, out of the wash entirely, on Tuvi's insistence the evening before, over Holt's objection that it meant a longer walk to water them each morning. That single argument, one only because Tuvi refused to back down on it, is the reason the expedition still had animals to carry water and supplies at all after that morning. Holt didn't apologize. He didn't have to. Something in the group had already shifted, and for the next 2 days, nobody argued when Tuvi picked the route. But agreement, it turned out, only lasted as long as the next inconvenience did. By the second week, water was the only thing anyone talked about. The canteens they'd filled at the rim were nearly empty, the mules were struggling, and the men had stopped speaking to each other in full sentences. Then they reached the limestone shelf, and below it, exactly where Tuvi had warned them not to drink, a spring ran clear and cold out of the rock. To 7 exhausted, dehydrated men, it looked less like a hazard and more like the only good news they'd had in days. Tuvi told them again, not this spring. There was another source, he said, less than half a day further, that was safe. Holt's patience, worn thin by heat and thirst, finally broke. He accused Tuvi of stalling, of deliberately routing them the long way for reasons Holt refused to name out loud but clearly suspected. 2 of the laborers, the same 2 who had laughed at the first warning and then said nothing after the flood, filled their canteens anyway and drank on the spot. This is where the account splits, because from here, the group effectively split too. 3 men, Holt included, argued that pushing on without drinking first was reckless and stayed at the spring to refill everything they carried. The packer and 1 laborer sided with Tuvi and pressed forward toward the second source, and the one man whose account survives, a laborer barely mentioned by name in the earlier pages of the record, found himself caught in between, close enough to Tuvi to have absorbed 3 days of warnings, but not yet willing to openly break from the men he'd signed on with. What that spring water actually contained wouldn't be understood for years. Certain limestone formations in the canyon's older strata leach heavy concentrations of dissolved minerals, including compounds that, in high enough doses, attacked the nervous system slowly rather than announcing themselves immediately. Nobody in that camp had the chemistry to know that. What they had was Tuvi's word, and by the 9th day of a 14-day supply run stretched to 16 days, his word wasn't enough anymore for the men who'd already decided he was the obstacle rather than the reason they were still alive. The two who drank first, the same pair who had laughed off the wash warning days earlier, felt fine within the hour and said so loudly enough that it undercut whatever caution the rest of the group had left. That's the cruelty of a slow poison. It doesn't announce itself when it would still be useful to listen. It waits until belief has already hardened into certainty, and by the following morning, 2 of the 3 men who had stayed behind at the spring were unable to stand. The symptoms didn't look like poisoning at first. They looked like exhaustion, the kind every man in that party had been fighting for 2 weeks. So nobody connected the dizziness and the cramping to the water until it was already the second thing wrong, not the first. Holt, still upright, still refusing to admit the guide had been right twice now, made the decision that would end the expedition entirely. He wanted to cut straight across the canyon's north wall to reach the trail out, rather than follow Tuvi's longer route around the base. It would save the better part of a day, and a day, to a man watching 2 of his own crew fail in front of him felt like the only thing left he could control. It was midday. The talus slope Tuvi had warned them about on the second morning, weeks earlier, sat directly in their path, and by now the sun had been baking that north-facing rock for hours. Tuvi refused to cross it. He said the words plainly this time, no longer softening them for men who had already ignored 2 out of 3. The rock there doesn't hold its footing once the heat gets into it, and neither will you. Holt crossed anyway, leading the healthiest of the remaining men. The laborer, who would become the sole survivor, started to follow, then stopped because Tuvi hadn't moved, and something about the stillness of a man who had been right twice already was more convincing in that moment than anything Holt had said in 3 weeks. He would never know exactly what he saw next because he wasn't looking directly at it. He heard the rock give first, a sound like a held breath finally let go, and by the time he turned, the slope Holt and the others had been crossing was no longer the shape it had been 10 seconds earlier. Silence followed for longer than felt possible. Then dust, settling slow over ground that had rearranged itself in a matter of seconds. He called out 3 names. Nothing answered him. He called them again and kept calling, moving along the rim of what was left of the slope for the better part of an hour until the light started to change, and Tuvi, without a word, put a hand on his shoulder and pulled him back from the edge. There was nothing left to search for that daylight would help with, and staying at the edge of unstable ground after a slide of that size was its own kind of second mistake waiting to happen. That was the moment. More than the wash and more than the spring, when the survivor stopped thinking of the warnings as advice he was choosing to follow. He understood finally that he had been standing next to the only person in the group who had actually known where they were. Here is where the account stops being a story about a bad decision and starts being a story about something else entirely, because the survivor, in the version he gave years later, insisted that Tuvi hadn't simply guessed right 3 times. He had explained, once they were alone and the last of the group was gone, that his own grandfather had lost people on that same stretch of canyon 2 generations earlier, and that the 3 warnings weren't rules invented for this trip. They were a route memorized and passed down of exactly the places along that particular corridor of the canyon where the land had killed before. Not a general caution about wilderness, a specific inherited map of failure points refined by people who had been moving through that terrain for far longer than anyone had been writing it down on paper. That detail reframes everything that came before it. The wash wasn't dangerous because all washes are dangerous. It was that wash at that bend because it had flooded before more than once, in living memory passed through a family rather than through a government survey. The spring wasn't a generic bad water source. It was known specifically as the spring that made people sick, tracked, and avoided for reasons nobody outside that knowledge had ever bothered to ask about. And the Talus slope wasn't just steep rock in the sun. It was the slope where, as far back as Tuvi's grandfather could account for, the ground had let go under people exactly like it let go under Holt. What the survivor was carrying, without fully realizing it for years afterward, wasn't luck. It was the only surviving copy of a warning system that predated the expedition by at least 2 generations, and that nobody had thought to write down anywhere the mining company would ever read it. The two of them were alone now, roughly 2 weeks into a trip that had been provisioned for far less, with most of the remaining supplies gone with the men who hadn't survived the slope. What followed was not a rescue story in any dramatic sense. It was 40 days of Tuvi teaching out of necessity rather than generosity everything he hadn't had time to explain earlier. Which plants held water, which side canyons offered shade without becoming traps, how to read a sky 40 miles away for a storm that hadn't reached you yet. They moved slowly, conserving strength instead of racing for the rim, because Tuvi understood something Holt never had, that panic kills faster than distance does. There were smaller lessons folded into those 40 days that the survivor only appreciated in hindsight. Tuvi taught him to travel in the cooler hours and rest through the worst heat of the afternoon, inverting the instinct to push hardest when the goal feels closest. He taught him to recognize the particular green of vegetation that meant water nearby without needing to see the water itself, and to test a questionable source in small amounts, hours apart, rather than drink freely and hope. None of it was dramatic. All of it was the accumulated, unglamorous knowledge of someone who had spent a lifetime treating the canyon as something to be read rather than conquered. And it was the only reason two people, instead of zero, eventually walked out of it. They were found in mid-August by a second mining party working a claim near the western end of the canyon, roughly 7 weeks after the original expedition had left the rim. The survivor was severely dehydrated, had lost close to a third of his body weight, and by his own later account, had stopped expecting to be found at all somewhere around the 30th day. Tuvi, by contrast, was described by the rescue party as tired but composed, having spent the better part of 2 months doing exactly what he had told the group he could do from the first morning. There is no surviving record of Tuvi filing any report of his own. The mining company that had financed the original expedition quietly absorbed the loss of 5 men and a considerable amount of equipment, and had little incentive to publicize the details of how badly its own engineer had misjudged the one person qualified to keep them alive. A short item ran in a regional paper that August, naming the rescued survivor and noting an unspecified guide without elaborating further. It was the kind of item that filled column space next to livestock prices and mining claims, and it drew no follow-up. That imbalance in the record is worth sitting with for a moment, because it isn't unique to this particular expedition. Across the mining and survey era of the American Southwest, indigenous guides were routinely the difference between parties that returned and parties that didn't, and just as routinely left out of the paperwork that later became the historical record. Company ledgers tracked wages, equipment, and losses. They rarely tracked judgment. A guide who kept a party alive for 6 uneventful weeks generated no story worth telling, while a guide blamed, however unfairly, for a single bad outcome could end up as the only name remembered. Tuvi's case runs in the opposite, rarer direction. A guide who was right every time, working for men who wrote his warnings down as a formality and ignored them as a habit, and who is barely named at all in the surviving paperwork, despite being the entire reason there was a survivor to interview decades later. The survivor's account didn't surface publicly until decades later, recorded almost in passing by a regional historian collecting oral histories from aging prospectors and their families. By then, Holt's name appeared in a handful of company ledgers and little else. The other 3 men who died on the slope and in the days after drinking from the spring are barely named at all, a detail that says as much about how the mining industry treated its labor as it does about the accuracy of the record. Tuvi's own fate afterward isn't clearly documented either, which is its own kind of answer, given how thoroughly the man who ignored him is remembered by comparison to how thinly the man who saved a life is recorded at all. What can be said with more confidence is this: the geological hazards Tuvi described, without the vocabulary of hydrology or mineralogy that would later explain them, map cleanly onto known documented dangers of that stretch of canyon country. Flash flooding and narrow drainages fed by storms outside the line of sight is a well-understood and still lethal phenomenon in the region today. Certain limestone-fed springs in the canyon's older formations are known to carry mineral concentrations unsafe for sustained drinking. And heat-driven rockfall on sun-exposed talus is a documented hazard park rangers still warn hikers about more than a century later. None of that proves every detail of the survivor's later account word for word. Oral history, recorded decades after the fact, rarely arrives without gaps, and the historian who eventually wrote it down was working from a single elderly interview, not a corroborated investigation. There is no way now to independently confirm the exact wash, the exact spring, or the exact slope, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But the pattern underneath the account, 3 specific hazards accurately located within a known and still treacherous stretch of canyon, correctly explained an outcome, if not in the chemistry or hydrology behind them, is difficult to wave away as coincidence or embellishment. Whoever originally mapped those 3 danger points, whether it was Tuvi's grandfather or generations before him, was working from direct, repeated, costly observation of the same land modern science would later explain from a different direction entirely. What actually separated the man who survived from the men who didn't wasn't intelligence, or fitness, or even luck in the moment the ground gave way. It was a willingness, repeated 3 separate times under 3 separate kinds of pressure, to accept a warning from someone he had no obligation to respect, over the confidence of a man he did. That's a harder thing to do than it sounds, especially when the warnings keep turning out to be inconvenient and the person giving them keeps being right in ways that cost you time, comfort, or pride to acknowledge. The canyon didn't spare the man who listened because he understood geology better than the others. It spared him because he was the only one still willing to be told something he didn't want to hear. Most survival stories get remembered for the danger. This one is worth remembering for the opposite reason. The danger was never really the mystery here. Flash floods, bad water, and unstable rock are ordinary hazards, the kind the canyon has produced for as long as people have walked into it. What made this expedition unusual wasn't what the land did. It was how long it took for the men inside that expedition to stop mistaking their own confidence for knowledge, and how much it cost them to learn the difference too late. If you want to understand the places where history nearly disappeared entirely, and the accounts that almost never made it into any record at all, that's exactly what we dig into every week here. So subscribe if that's the kind of story you don't want to keep missing. And before you go, if you'd been in that camp at the spring on the 5th night with a guide telling you to walk another mile before dark for reasons he wouldn't fully explain, would you have listened? Let me know in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.